The boxes were packed. The moving truck was loaded. And somewhere between goodbye and hello, a woman simply stopped existing. Picture this for just a moment. It's September 1988, and the leaves are just beginning to turn gold in rural Illinois. A family of four stands in the driveway of their modest ranch home, taking one final look at the place where they built their life together. The father behind the wheel of the moving truck, two children buckled into the family sedan, and a mother, a wife, a woman named Elizabeth Anne Crawford, following closely behind in her own vehicle as they begin this 6-hour journey to their new life in Missouri. But Elizabeth never arrived. She never pulled into that new driveway. She never unpacked those boxes filled with memories. She never kissed her children goodnight in their new bedrooms. Elizabeth Crawford vanished somewhere on that stretch of Illinois highway, and for 35 years, nobody could explain how a woman could simply evaporate into thin air while surrounded by her own family. I'm about to take you through one of the most chilling cold cases in Illinois history, a story that haunted a small community for decades, a mystery that left two children growing up without answers, without closure, and without their mother. This is the story of how the truth finally clawed its way out of the darkness, and I promise you, the ending will leave you questioning everything you think you know about the people who claim to love us most. But here's what I need from you right now. If you believe that every missing person deserves to have their story told, if you believe that justice should never have an expiration date, then share this video. Hit that subscribe button. Because stories like Elizabeth's only stay alive when people like you refuse to let them fade away. The family members who never stopped searching for answers, they need to know that Elizabeth's story matters, that she mattered. So stay with me through every chapter, and together, let's bring this woman home. In September of 1988, the small town of Ridgewood, Illinois, was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. Population hovering around 4,000 souls, Ridgewood sat nestled along the Rock River, a community built on farming, faith, and the unshakable belief that neighbors looked out for one another. The kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where children rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on, and where scandal was nothing more than whispered gossip about whose kid got caught sneaking out past curfew. The Crawford family had been fixtures in Ridgewood for nearly 15 years. Richard Crawford, 42 years old, had built a reputation as a hard-working sales manager at a regional agricultural supply company. He was the type of man who showed up at every football game, shook hands firmly at church on Sundays, and always had a friendly way for passing neighbors. Elizabeth, 3 years his junior, had poured her heart into raising their two children, Jessica and Daniel, while also volunteering at the elementary school library and organizing the annual Community Harvest Festival. From the outside looking in, they were the picture-perfect American family. But in the summer of 1988, Richard Crawford announced that his company was transferring him to their Missouri branch. It was an opportunity, he told friends and neighbors. A promotion, a chance for a bigger house, better schools, a fresh start for his family. The announcement came suddenly, catching many in the community off guard. After all, the Crawfords had deep roots in Ridgewood. Elizabeth's elderly mother lived just 20 minutes away. Jessica was about to enter her junior year of high school, and Daniel, only 12, was devastated at the thought of leaving his little league teammates behind. Still, Richard insisted. The move was happening, and it was happening fast. The weeks leading up to their departure were a blur of activity. Elizabeth spent long days packing up 15 years of accumulated life, wrapping dishes in newspaper, labeling boxes with careful handwriting, taking photographs of rooms she would never see again. Neighbors who stopped by to say goodbye later recalled that Elizabeth seemed tired, stressed, perhaps even hesitant about the upcoming move, though she never complained directly. Dorothy Winters, Elizabeth's closest friend in Ridgewood, would later tell investigators something that lingered in the air like smoke from a dying fire. She said that 3 days before the move, she had coffee with Elizabeth on her back porch. The boxes were everywhere, the house in chaos, and Elizabeth had seemed distant, distracted. When Dorothy asked if she was excited about the new adventure, Elizabeth had paused for a long moment before answering. Sometimes, Elizabeth had said quietly, I wonder if we're running towards something or away from something." Dorothy had laughed it off at the time, assuming it was just the anxiety of such a major life change. But that sentence would haunt her for the next 3.5 decades. On the morning of September 17th, 1988, the Crawford family gathered for the final time at their Ridgewood home. The moving truck, rented from a national company, sat heavy and full in the driveway. Richard would drive the truck, leading the way to their new life. Jessica and Daniel would ride together in the family's primary vehicle, a burgundy Ford Taurus. And Elizabeth would follow behind in her own car, a silver 1985 Honda Accord that had been her pride and joy since Richard surprised her with it for their 10th anniversary. The plan was simple. They would caravan together, stopping halfway for lunch, arriving at their new Missouri home by early evening. The previous owners had already vacated, and the keys were waiting for them with a neighbor. That night, they would sleep on air mattresses surrounded by boxes, and in the morning, they would begin building their new life. Neighbors watched them pull away around 8:30 that morning. Mrs. Holloway from across the street remembered waving from her kitchen window, seeing Elizabeth's silver Honda bringing up the rear of the small convoy. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed fine. But something happened on that stretch of Illinois highway. Something that would transform a routine family move into one of the state's most enduring mysteries. They made their first stop around 11 that morning at a gas station near Peoria, approximately 90 miles from Ridgewood. Richard filled up the moving truck while the kids used the restroom. Elizabeth, according to Richard's later statement to police, had parked on the opposite side of the station to fill her own tank. When the family was ready to continue, Richard said he saw Elizabeth wave from her car, indicating she was ready to go. They pulled back onto the highway, the truck leading, the Taurus following, and Elizabeth's silver Honda supposedly bringing up the rear. But here's where the story begins to crack. When the family stopped for lunch at a diner near Springfield, approximately 100 miles further down the road, Elizabeth's Honda was nowhere to be seen. Richard told his children not to worry. Their mother had probably stopped for something, maybe gotten turned around, perhaps decided to take a different route. They waited at the diner for over an hour, ordering food they barely touched, watching the parking lot for any sign of that familiar silver car. It never appeared. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Richard Crawford walked into the Springfield Police Department and reported his wife missing. He was calm, according to officers who were present, concerned but composed. He explained the situation clearly, provided a description of Elizabeth and her vehicle, and asked what should be done next. The officers, following standard procedure for missing adults, suggested that perhaps Elizabeth had simply gotten lost. After all, this was 1988. No cell phones, no GPS navigation, long highway stretches where it was easy to miss an exit or take a wrong turn. They advised Richard to continue to the new house in Missouri, wait by the phone, and contact them if Elizabeth hadn't appeared by morning. Richard Crawford did exactly that. He loaded his confused, frightened children back into the Taurus, climbed behind the wheel of the moving truck, and drove the remaining hours to Missouri without his wife. That night, Jessica and Daniel fell asleep on their air mattresses in a strange new house, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of a building that already felt haunted by absence. Elizabeth never called. She never arrived. And the next morning, when Richard Crawford picked up the phone to report that his wife was still missing, the wheels of an investigation began to turn. An investigation that would grind to a halt with no answers, leaving a community wondering for 35 years what really happened to Elizabeth and Crawford on that September day in 1988. The search for Elizabeth Crawford began slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the authorities couldn't quite believe that a grown woman could simply vanish during a family road trip. In those first critical hours, the investigation was hampered by jurisdictional confusion, outdated communication systems, and a prevailing assumption that would poison the case from its very inception. The assumption was simple, and in 1988, it was all too common. Elizabeth Crawford was an adult woman. Adults had the right to disappear if they chose to. Perhaps she had simply decided to leave, to abandon her life, her marriage, her children. Perhaps this was nothing more than a case of a wife running away from domestic unhappiness. This assumption would cost investigators precious time and critical evidence. Richard Crawford, however, played the role of worried husband with remarkable precision. He called the Ridgewood Police, the Springfield Police, and eventually the Missouri State Highway Patrol. He appeared on local news stations with tears glistening in his eyes, clutching a recent photograph of Elizabeth, begging anyone with information to come forward. He set up a tip line in the New Missouri house, sitting by the phone for hours, waiting for a call that never came. Jessica and Daniel, meanwhile, were living through a nightmare that no child should ever have to endure. They had lost not only their mother, but also every anchor of their previous life. New town, new house, new school where they knew no one. And everywhere they went, the whispers followed them. The pitying glances, the questions that had no answers. Daniel, just 12 years old, would later describe those first weeks in Missouri as feeling like he was trapped inside a glass box, watching the world move around him while he remained frozen, unable to reach out, unable to break free. He remembered his father's strange calmness, the way Richard would sit at the kitchen table late at night, staring at maps spread across the surface, tracing possible routes with his finger while muttering to himself. Jessica, 16 and already carrying the weight of impending adulthood, became a surrogate mother almost overnight. She cooked meals from whatever meager groceries they had. She helped Daniel with homework when he could barely concentrate. She held him when he cried in the darkness, promising him that their mother would come home, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of her own heart. Back in Ridgewood, the community was reeling. Elizabeth had been a beloved figure, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who always had an encouraging word, who never seemed to carry an ounce of malice in her entire being. The idea that she might have simply chosen to leave felt wrong to those who knew her best. Dorothy Winters was among the first to voice her doubts to investigators. She told them about that final coffee conversation, about Elizabeth's cryptic words regarding running towards something or away from something. She told them that Elizabeth would never, under any circumstances, have willingly abandoned her children. Not Elizabeth, who had dedicated her entire adult life to Jessica and Daniel. Not Elizabeth, who used to say that being their mother was the only job she ever truly wanted. But the investigators in 1988 were operating with limited resources and even more limited imagination. They checked the obvious boxes. They searched for the silver Honda along the highway routes between Ridgewood and Missouri. They interviewed gas station attendants and diner staff. They checked hospital records and morgue reports. They even reached out to Elizabeth's elderly mother, hoping perhaps that the daughter had returned home, confused or ill. Elizabeth's mother, a fragile woman named Virginia, nearly collapsed when she heard the news. She had spoken to Elizabeth just 2 days before the move, and her daughter had seemed fine. Tired, yes. A little melancholy about leaving Ridgewood, certainly. But there had been no indication that anything was seriously wrong. The silver Honda remained the key. If they could find the car, they might find Elizabeth. If they could find Elizabeth, they might understand what had happened. But the Honda had vanished as completely as its owner. By mid-October, nearly a month after Elizabeth's disappearance, the active investigation began to wind down. There were no leads, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play. The case file grew thin and dusty on a shelf, marked with the unsatisfying notation of missing person, unresolved. Richard Crawford, meanwhile, had begun to settle into his new life in Missouri with troubling speed. He enrolled the children in their new schools. He unpacked the boxes that Elizabeth had so carefully packed. He returned to work at the agricultural supply company, telling sympathetic colleagues that he was trying to stay strong for his kids. And then, 8 months after Elizabeth vanished, Richard Crawford did something that made Dorothy Winters' blood run cold when she heard about it. He filed for divorce. The legal mechanism he used was called divorce by abandonment. In Missouri at the time, a spouse could file for divorce if their partner had been absent for 1 continuous year. But Richard didn't wait the full year. He petitioned the court for an expedited process, arguing that the circumstances were extraordinary, that his wife had clearly abandoned the family, and that he needed legal closure to move forward with raising his children. The court, apparently moved by his tearful testimony about the pain of not knowing, granted his request. In the spring of 1989, less than a year after Elizabeth disappeared, Richard Crawford was officially a single man. Dorothy Winters drove to Missouri when she heard the news. She showed up at Richard's new house unannounced, demanding answers. How could he give up on Elizabeth so quickly? How could he act as if his wife of 17 years was already dead when there was no body, no proof, no closure? Richard's response, according to Dorothy, was chilling in its controlled detachment. He told her that he had to think about the children. He said that living in limbo wasn't healthy for Jessica or Daniel. He claimed that moving forward was the only way to heal, the only way to give his kids any chance at a normal life. And then he asked Dorothy, very politely, to leave his property and never contact his family again. Dorothy never forgot the look in his eyes during that conversation. She described it to investigators years later as a door that had been firmly closed. Not grief, not confusion, not the raw, ragged emotion of a man who had lost his beloved wife. Just a door, closed and locked, with nothing visible behind it. But Dorothy Winters was not a woman who gave up easily. She returned to Ridgewood and began doing something that would prove crucial decades later. She started keeping a record. Every rumor she heard about the Crawfords, she wrote down. Every inconsistency in Richard's story that she noticed, she documented. Every conversation she had ever had with Elizabeth, she tried to recall and preserve in writing. She didn't know why she was doing it, not really. Perhaps it was grief. Perhaps it was guilt that she hadn't pushed harder when Elizabeth seemed troubled. Perhaps it was simply a refusal to let her friend disappear into the abyss of forgotten cases. Whatever her motivation, Dorothy Winters became Elizabeth Crawford's unofficial advocate, a one-woman crusade for justice in a world that seemed determined to forget. Meanwhile, Jessica and Daniel were growing up in the shadow of their mother's absence. Jessica graduated high school in Missouri, attended a local community college, and eventually moved away to build a life as far from her father as possible. She rarely spoke about her mother, and when asked, she would simply say that some wounds never fully heal. Daniel took a different path. He became obsessed with finding answers. As soon as he was old enough to understand what the internet could offer, he began researching missing persons cases, studying investigative techniques, connecting with online communities dedicated to solving cold cases. He created a website dedicated to his mother, posting her photograph, her description, and a timeline of that fateful September day in 1988. And he waited, year after year, for someone somewhere to remember something that might bring his mother home. Let me ask you something right now, and I really want you to think about this. If you knew something about a missing person, even something small, even something that seemed insignificant, would you speak up? Or would you let the years pass, convincing yourself that it probably didn't matter? Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Because sometimes, the smallest piece of information is the key that unlocks everything. The years turned into decades, and the world that had lost Elizabeth Crawford changed beyond recognition. The Berlin Wall fell. The internet connected humanity in ways no one had imagined. A new millennium dawned, bringing with it technological advances that transformed how crimes were investigated and solved. But in Missouri, Richard Crawford continued living his quiet life, growing older, growing grayer, growing more comfortable in the belief that whatever secrets he carried would follow him to the grave. He never remarried after the expedited divorce from Elizabeth. Some in the new community found this touching, a sign that he had truly loved his lost wife and could never replace her. Others found it strange, noting that Richard seemed perfectly content with his solitude, showing no interest in companionship or romance. Jessica had married in her late 20s, a kind man named Marcus who understood that his wife carried wounds that might never fully close. They had 2 children of their own, and Jessica threw herself into motherhood with a fierce devotion that sometimes frightened her. She would stand over her sleeping babies, watching them breathe, promising them silently that she would never, ever leave them wondering where their mother had gone. She maintained only minimal contact with her father. Christmas cards, the occasional phone call on birthdays, A relationship preserved more out of obligation than genuine connection. When her children asked about their grandmother, Jessica showed them photographs and told them that Elizabeth had been lost, that sometimes people disappeared and no one knew why, and that they should always cherish the people they love because nothing in life was guaranteed. Daniel, meanwhile, had transformed his childhood obsession into a career. He became a private investigator, specializing in missing persons cases. Every lost soul he helped find was a surrogate for the mother he couldn't locate. Every family he reunited was a balm on the wound that had never healed. He was good at his job, relentless and intuitive, driven by a personal understanding of what it meant to spend a lifetime waiting for answers. But his own mother's case remained frustratingly cold. In 2005, Daniel had reached out to a true crime television program, hoping that national exposure might shake loose some forgotten memory. The show featured Elizabeth's case in a segment that aired to millions of viewers across the country. The tip line lit up with calls, but none of them led anywhere useful. False sightings, mistaken identities, the occasional cruel hoax from people with nothing better to do than torture a grieving family. Daniel refused to give up. He hired forensic specialists to create an age-progressed image of what Elizabeth might look like in her 60s. He consulted with FBI profilers about the likely scenarios surrounding her disappearance. He even tracked down the original investigators, now retired and elderly, hoping they might remember some detail that hadn't made it into the official reports. One of those retired investigators, a man named Detective Harold Brennan, told Daniel something that would haunt him for years. Detective Brennan admitted that from the very beginning, something about Richard Crawford had bothered him. The calm, the composure, the way he had all the answers ready before the questions were even asked. Brennan said he had pushed for a deeper investigation into Richard himself, had wanted to search the moving truck and examine the New Missouri property, but he had been overruled by superiors who saw no evidence of foul play. Your father, Brennan said, choosing his words carefully, was too perfect, too polished. I've seen a lot of grieving husbands in my career, and they all have one thing in common. They're a mess. They forget things. They contradict themselves. They fall apart. Your father never fell apart, not once. He had every answer, every explanation, every document right at his fingertips. It was like he had rehearsed for a test he knew was coming. Daniel asked the detective why. If he had such strong suspicions, nothing had been done. Brennan's answer was heartbreakingly simple. Suspicion isn't evidence. And in 1988, without a body, without a witness, without a single piece of physical proof, there was nothing we could do. Your father knew that. Somewhere deep in his core, he knew exactly what he could get away with. Those words became the fuel for Daniel's continued search. He began investigating his own father with the same intensity he brought to his professional cases. He tracked Richard's movements in the months before the move, discovering that his father had taken several unexplained trips in the weeks leading up to September 17th. He reviewed financial records from that era, finding irregularities that had been overlooked in the original investigation. Most significantly, Daniel discovered that his father had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Elizabeth just 6 months before she disappeared. The policy had never been cashed, which seemed to argue against financial motive. But Daniel noticed something else, something that made his investigators' instincts scream. The policy contained a clause that would only pay out in the event of a confirmed death. A disappearance, without proof of death, would not trigger the payout. Richard Crawford had known this. And Richard Crawford had never once attempted to have Elizabeth declared legally dead, even when the 7-year waiting period had long since passed. It was as if Richard knew that a legal investigation into Elizabeth's death might uncover something he desperately wanted to keep hidden. But knowing and proving were two vastly different things. In 2012, Daniel made the difficult decision to confront his father directly. He drove to Missouri, to the same house where he had spent his confused, grief-stricken adolescence, and knocked on the door. Richard Crawford, now 76 years old, opened the door and stared at his son with an expression that Daniel would later describe as reptilian. Cold, calculating, utterly devoid of paternal warmth. They sat in the living room, surrounded by furniture that Daniel still recognized from his childhood, and had a conversation that lasted nearly 3 hours. Daniel asked direct questions about that day in September 1988. He pushed on the inconsistencies in his father's story. He presented the evidence he had gathered over years of investigation. And Richard Crawford smiled. He actually smiled. He told Daniel that he understood the need for closure, that he himself had spent years wondering what had happened to Elizabeth. He expressed sympathy for the pain his son had clearly been carrying. He acknowledged that the circumstances were strange and that questions were natural. But he answered nothing. Every direct question was deflected with vague phrases about the complexity of memory, the passage of time, the difficulty of reconstructing events from so long ago. Every piece of evidence Daniel presented was dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation. Every accusation was met with wounded denial. When Daniel finally left that house, he was more certain than ever that his father was guilty, but he was no closer to proving it. The years continued to pass. Richard Crawford grew older, frilier, apparently untouchable. Daniel kept investigating, kept searching, kept refusing to let his mother become just another forgotten statistic. And in the background, quietly working toward an ending that no one could have predicted, the wheels of justice finally began to turn. It started, as so many cold case breakthroughs do, with advances in technology that didn't exist in 1988. The year was 2019, and a young forensic analyst named Dr. Samantha Park was reviewing cold case files in a state archive facility in Springfield, Illinois. She had been hired as part of a new initiative to apply modern investigative techniques to cases that had gone cold before DNA analysis, digital forensics, and advanced database searches became standard tools. Elizabeth Crawford's file crossed her desk in February of that year, just another yellowed folder among hundreds. But something about the case caught Dr. Park's attention. Perhaps it was the photograph of Elizabeth, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, frozen forever at 39 years old. Perhaps it was the brief notes about the suspicious circumstances, the moving day disappearance, the husband who never seemed quite right. Perhaps it was simply intuition, that inexplicable sense that some cases deserve more attention than others. Whatever the reason, Dr. Park pulled Elizabeth's file from the stack and began reading with the intensity of someone who had just discovered a puzzle that demanded solving. The first thing she noticed was the inadequacy of the original investigation. By modern standards, the 1988 inquiry had been shockingly incomplete. There had been no thorough search of the moving truck, no forensic examination of the vehicles, no detailed interviews with Elizabeth's family members about her state of mind, no financial investigation beyond the most cursory review. The second thing she noticed was that certain evidence had been collected but never analyzed. Specifically, there were samples taken from Elizabeth's silver Honda, which had been discovered abandoned in a rural area near Peoria in late October of 1988, more than a month after she vanished. The car had been found in a wooded area off a little-used county road, seemingly hidden from view, with no signs of Elizabeth anywhere nearby. At the time, investigators had collected samples from the car's interior, but lacked the technology to extract useful information from them. These samples had been preserved in evidence storage, waiting for a future that had finally arrived. Dr. Park requested the samples and submitted them for modern DNA analysis. The results came back in June of 2019, and they changed everything. The DNA profile extracted from stains in the trunk of Elizabeth's Honda matched Elizabeth herself. That alone wasn't surprising. It was her car, after all. But the pattern of the biological material told a different story. The stains were consistent with decomposition, with a body that had been transported in that trunk for some period of time. Elizabeth Crawford had not simply walked away from her life. She had been in that trunk, likely already dead, while her own car was driven to its final resting place in those lonely woods. This was the evidence that had been waiting 3 decades to be discovered. This was the proof that Elizabeth's disappearance was not abandonment, but murder. Dr. Park immediately contacted the Illinois State Police, and within weeks, a new investigation was launched. This time, the investigators had advantages that their predecessors had lacked. They had DNA technology. They had decades of financial records to examine. They had the ability to interview witnesses using techniques that had been refined over years of criminal psychology research. And they had Daniel Crawford, a private investigator who had spent his adult life building a case against his own father. When the lead detective on the new investigation, a sharp-eyed woman named Detective Angela Reyes, reached out to Daniel, he initially couldn't believe what he was hearing. After so many years of dead ends, so many disappointments, the idea that his mother's case might finally be solved felt like a dream from which he was terrified to wake. But Detective Reyes was real, and her evidence was real, and for the first time since September of 1988, Elizabeth Crawford's story was being taken seriously by people with the power to do something about it. Daniel shared everything he had gathered over the years. The suspicious trips his father had taken before the move. The life insurance policy with its telling exemption for disappearance. The interview with retired Detective Brennan. The cold, calculating smile that Richard had worn during their confrontation in 2012. Detective Reyes listened, took notes, and made a promise that Daniel had waited a lifetime to hear. We're going to find out what happened to your mother. And if your father is responsible, we're going to make sure he answers for it. The investigation moved forward with a momentum that felt almost miraculous. Financial records from 1988 were subpoenaed and analyzed, revealing that Richard Crawford had withdrawn a substantial amount of cash in the weeks before the move, cash that had never been accounted for. Property records showed that Richard had visited the Missouri house twice before the official moving date, ostensibly to prepare for the family's arrival, but leaving questions about what else he might have been preparing. Witnesses who had been too young to interview in 1988 were now adults with their own memories to share. One woman, who had been a teenager working at the gas station near Peoria where the family had stopped, remembered seeing a silver Honda, but wasn't certain she had seen the driver. Another man, who had lived near where the Honda was eventually discovered, recalled seeing a vehicle matching its description being driven through the area late at night in September of 1988. Most crucially, the investigation uncovered something that had been completely missed in 1988, Richard Crawford's affair. He had been involved with a woman named Carolyn Mitchell, who had worked at his company's Illinois branch. The affair had been going on for at least 2 years before Elizabeth's disappearance. Carolyn, now elderly and dealing with her own mortality, finally agreed to speak to investigators about what she knew. Her testimony was devastating. Carolyn Mitchell admitted that Richard had spoken about wanting to leave his marriage, but Elizabeth had refused to consider divorce. She was Catholic, deeply devoted to her faith, and had told Richard that marriage was sacred, that she would never agree to end it. Carolyn said that Richard had grown increasingly frustrated with this situation, that he had begun speaking about Elizabeth in cold, detached terms, as if she were an obstacle to be overcome rather than a partner to be cherished. In August of 1988, just a month before the family move, Richard had told Carolyn something that she had tried to forget for 30 years. He had said that by the time they arrived in Missouri, things would be different. He had said that Elizabeth wouldn't be a problem anymore. Carolyn had assumed he meant that Elizabeth had finally agreed to a divorce. She had wanted to believe that, needed to believe it. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. So she had buried her doubts, moved on with her own life, and tried to forget that Richard Crawford had ever existed. But now, with investigators asking direct questions, she couldn't hide any longer. With Carolyn's testimony, the DNA evidence from the trunk, the financial irregularities, and the years of suspicious behavior, the state's attorney's office made a decision that would shake Richard Crawford's carefully constructed world to its foundation. On March 15, 2023, 34 and a half years after Elizabeth Crawford vanished, an arrest warrant was issued for Richard James Crawford on charges of first-degree murder. The arrest happened on a quiet Tuesday morning in Missouri. Richard Crawford, now 87 years old, was sitting on his front porch, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, when 2 unmarked vehicles pulled into his driveway. Detective Reyes stepped out of the lead car, accompanied by 3 other officers and a representative from the Missouri State Police who would assist with the cross-jurisdictional arrest. She walked up the porch steps slowly, her footsteps echoing in the morning silence, and stood before the man who had evaded justice for more than 3 decades. Richard looked up at her with those cold, calculating eyes that Daniel had described. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't seem afraid. He simply set down his coffee cup with measured precision and asked, in a voice that betrayed no emotion whatsoever, what he could do for the officers this morning. Detective Reyes informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Elizabeth and Crawford. She read him his rights while the other officers approached to place him in handcuffs. Throughout the entire process, Richard Crawford said nothing. He offered no resistance, no denial, no protestation of innocence. He simply allowed himself to be handcuffed and led to the waiting vehicle, as if this were an appointment he had always known was coming. The news spread through Ridgewood, Illinois, like wildfire through dry grass. The quiet little town that had lost one of its own back in 1988 suddenly found itself at the center of national attention. News vans descended on Main Street. Reporters knocked on doors, seeking anyone who remembered Elizabeth, anyone who had suspected Richard, anyone who could provide color and context to the story that was captivating the country. Dorothy Winters, now 91 years old and living in an assisted care facility, wept when she heard the news. She had never stopped believing that Richard was responsible. She had kept her records, added to them over the years, and had passed everything along to Daniel when she realized she wouldn't live forever. Now, finally, her faith in justice had been vindicated. She gave one interview, speaking to a national news program from her room at the care facility. Her voice was thin with age, but her words were as sharp as they had been decades earlier. "Elizabeth was my friend," she said, her eyes bright with tears she had carried for too long. She trusted that man, loved that man, built her whole life around that man. And he took everything from her. He took her life, and then he took her children's childhoods, and then he took 35 years of closure from everyone who loved her. I'm grateful I lived long enough to see him answer for it. I just wish Elizabeth could see it too. Daniel and Jessica reunited for the first time in years, brought together by the news they had both spent their lives waiting to hear. They met at a hotel near the Missouri courthouse, two siblings forever bonded by tragedy, and held each other while the weight of decades lifted incrementally from their shoulders. Jessica, who had spent so many years trying to bury the pain of her mother's loss, found herself suddenly overwhelmed by emotions she had kept locked away. She told Daniel that she felt guilty, that she had distanced herself from the search for answers because it hurt too much to hope. She apologized for not being a better sister, for not supporting his relentless quest the way she should have. Daniel told her that there was nothing to apologize for. Survival looked different for everyone, and the only person who deserved blame was the man currently sitting in a Missouri jail cell. The arraignment was scheduled for the following week. Richard Crawford, dressed in an orange jumpsuit that made his aged frame look somehow even smaller, stood before a judge and entered a plea of not guilty. His court-appointed attorney, a young man clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case, requested bail, arguing that Richard's advanced age and lack of previous criminal record made him an unlikely flight risk. The prosecutor, a formidable woman named District Attorney Rachel Thornburg, argued passionately against bail. She detailed the evidence against Richard, the DNA that proved Elizabeth had been transported in the trunk of her own car, the testimony of his former mistress, the years of suspicious behavior that pointed to careful premeditation. She painted a picture of a man who had spent 3.5 decades evading justice, who had shown no remorse, who had forced his own children to grow up wondering if their mother had simply abandoned them. The judge, weighing the arguments, denied bail. Richard Crawford would remain in custody until his trial. For Daniel and Jessica, watching from the gallery, the sight of their father in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffed and defeated, stirred emotions that were impossible to categorize. There was satisfaction, certainly. Justice, finally, was being served. But there was also grief, a fresh wave of it, as if Elizabeth had died all over again. Seeing Richard arrested, seeing the case move forward, made the reality of their mother's murder somehow more concrete than it had been during all those years of uncertainty. The trial was set for the following year, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. The prosecution would need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Richard Crawford had murdered his wife on or around September 17, 1988. The defense would need to create enough uncertainty to prevent conviction. In a case this old, with so much evidence lost to time, the outcome was far from certain. But for the first time since that terrible September day, Elizabeth Crawford's family had hope. Daniel threw himself into assisting the prosecution, providing everything he had gathered over the years, introducing them to witnesses he had tracked down, helping them understand the patterns of behavior that pointed to his father's guilt. He was careful not to overstep, not to compromise the case with his personal involvement, but he made himself available for anything the prosecution needed. Jessica, meanwhile, began the painful process of sharing her own memories. She met with prosecutors and described her childhood, her relationship with her mother, the subtle tensions she had sensed in her parents' marriage even as a teenager. She recalled moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but took on new meaning in light of what they now knew. She remembered her father's strange calm during the drive to Missouri, his lack of visible concern as the hours passed with no sign of Elizabeth. She remembered how quickly he had moved to establish their new life, unpacking boxes and arranging furniture with an efficiency that seemed inappropriate for a man whose wife had just vanished. She remembered the divorce filing, the way her father had explained it to her with a coldness that made her skin crawl even then. He said that we had to be realistic, Jessica told the prosecutors, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. He said that your mother chose to leave us, and we shouldn't waste our lives waiting for someone who didn't want to be found. I was 17 years old, and I believed him. I believed my father when he told me my mother had abandoned me. I spent years being angry at her, grieving her, feeling rejected by her. And the whole time, she was dead. He killed her, and then he killed my love for her. That's what I can never forgive. The months of preparation passed slowly, each one bringing the trial closer while also extending the agonizing wait for resolution. The media attention never fully faded, flaring up whenever there was a new development, a new hearing, a new piece of evidence discovered. And then, something happened that no one had anticipated. Elizabeth Crawford was found. It happened in October of 2023, just 4 months before the trial was scheduled to begin. A construction crew working on a new development in rural Missouri, not far from where the Crawford family had planned to build their new life, unearthed something unexpected beneath the foundation of an old barn that was being demolished. Human remains. The bones had been buried deep, wrapped in deteriorating plastic sheeting that had been state-of-the-art in 1988, but had degraded significantly over 35 years. A silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant was found among the remains, a necklace that Jessica immediately identified as belonging to her mother. Elizabeth Crawford had been hidden less than 2 miles from the house where Richard had raised his children without her. The discovery transformed the case from a circumstantial prosecution into something far more concrete. Forensic anthropologists determined that the remains were consistent with a woman of Elizabeth's age and physical description. DNA extracted from the bones confirmed the identification beyond any doubt. More significantly, examination of the remains revealed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, trauma that was consistent with homicide. Elizabeth had not died peacefully. She had not wandered off and succumbed to natural causes. She had been murdered, struck with tremendous force, and then buried in a location that Richard Crawford had access to. The prosecution's case, already strong, became overwhelming. Investigators retraced Richard's movements in 1988 and discovered that the old barn where Elizabeth was buried had belonged to a distant relative of Richard's, a cousin who had died in the mid-1990s without any close heirs. The property had passed through several hands since then, but in September of 1988, Richard would have known about it, would have had access to it, would have recognized it as a perfect place to hide a body. Daniel was present when the forensic team finished their work at the site. He stood at the edge of the excavation, looking down at the place where his mother had been hidden for more than 3 decades, and felt something shift inside him. It was not closure, not yet, but it was something approaching it. A sense that his mother was no longer lost, no longer a question mark suspended in eternal uncertainty. She had been found. She could be buried properly, mourned properly, remembered properly. Whatever happened at the trial, whatever verdict the jury reached, Elizabeth and Crawford would finally have a grave with her name on it. Jessica flew in to be with her brother when the news broke. The siblings stood together at the forensic site, holding hands, saying nothing because there were no words adequate to the moment. When the last of Elizabeth's remains had been carefully removed and transported for analysis, Daniel and Jessica walked to their rental car in silence. It was Jessica who finally spoke, as they drove away from the field that had held their mother's secret for so long. "Do you think she suffered?" Daniel considered the question carefully. The forensic evidence suggested that the blunt force trauma to Elizabeth's skull would have caused death quickly, perhaps even instantaneously. But there was no way to know for certain what Elizabeth's final moments had been like, whether she had seen the blow coming, whether she had understood what was happening, whether she had thought of her children in those last seconds. "I think," Daniel said slowly, "that she knew we loved her. Whatever happened, she knew that. And I think she's been waiting all these years for us to find her, to tell the truth about what happened. Now we can do that. Now we can give her that." The discovery of Elizabeth's remains added new charges to the indictment against Richard Crawford. The prosecution amended their case to include the evidence from the burial site, the forensic analysis of the skull trauma, and the connection to the property that Richard had known about in 1988. The defense, meanwhile, found their already difficult task becoming nearly impossible. Their client's stoic denial was crumbling in the face of mounting evidence. The DNA from the trunk, the testimony of Carolyn Mitchell, and now, the body itself, buried in a location directly connected to Richard Crawford. The defense attorney requested a meeting with the prosecutor to discuss the possibility of a plea bargain. District Attorney Thornburg was initially reluctant. This was a case that deserved a full trial, a complete airing of the evidence, a formal declaration of guilt before a jury of peers. The family had waited 35 years for justice. They deserved to see it delivered in open court. But she also recognized that a trial carried risks. Richard Crawford was 87 years old and in declining health. If he died before a verdict was reached, there would be no official resolution, no formal acknowledgement of his guilt. A plea bargain, while less satisfying than a conviction, would guarantee the outcome the family needed. She brought the decision to Daniel and Jessica, explaining the options, the risks, the considerations that went into this moment of terrible choice. Daniel and Jessica discussed it privately, weighing their desire for a full trial against the fear of Richard escaping accountability through death. They thought about their mother, about what she would have wanted, about what kind of justice would truly honor her memory. In the end, they agreed to let the prosecution pursue a plea bargain, but only under specific conditions. Richard Crawford would have to plead guilty to first-degree murder in open court. He would have to allocute, to describe in his own words what he had done to Elizabeth. He would have to face his children while he admitted the truth that he had hidden for 35 years. And he would spend every remaining day of his life in prison. The defense brought these conditions to their client. And Richard Crawford, facing the overwhelming evidence against him, finally did something that no one had ever seen him do before. He agreed to tell the truth. The plea hearing was scheduled for February of 2024 in the same Illinois courthouse where the case had been filed. The gallery was packed with media, with curious observers, with residents of Ridgewood who remembered Elizabeth and wanted to witness the moment of reckoning. Daniel and Jessica sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's table, their eyes fixed on the door through which their father would enter. When Richard Crawford was brought into the courtroom, he looked even older than his 87 years. Prison had not been kind to him. His skin hung loosely on his frame, his eyes were sunken and clouded, and he moved with the shuffling gait of a man whose body was failing him in ways both visible and invisible. But his mind, the defense attorney assured the court, was still competent. He understood the proceedings. He understood the charges. He understood what he was about to admit. The judge, a solemn man named Justice William Mercer, asked Richard Crawford if he was entering his guilty plea voluntarily, without coercion or promise of benefit beyond the agreed-upon terms. Richard answered yes. The judge asked if Richard understood that by pleading guilty, he was giving up his right to a trial, to confront witnesses, to present a defense. Richard answered yes. And then the judge asked Richard Crawford to tell the court, in his own words, what he had done to his wife on September 17, 1988. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. The scratch of reporters' pens against notebooks ceased. The hum of whispered conversations died away. Every eye fixed on the old man in the orange jumpsuit as he began to speak. His voice was thin, reedy with age, but his words were clear. "I killed Elizabeth that morning, before we left Ridgewood." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Jessica's face went pale. Richard continued, his voice maintaining that same flat, emotionless quality that had characterized his entire demeanor since his arrest. He explained that he had told Elizabeth he wanted to check the moving truck one final time before they departed. He had asked her to come with him, to help him verify that everything was properly loaded. She had followed him to the truck, standing in the doorway, looking at the carefully packed boxes that contained their entire life together. He had struck her from behind with a tire iron. She had fallen without a sound. He had wrapped her body in plastic sheeting he had hidden in the truck for exactly this purpose. He had placed her in the trunk of her own car, knowing that no one would think to look there during the chaos of a moving day. The family had departed Ridgewood with Elizabeth already dead. At the gas station stop near Peoria, Richard had told his children that their mother was filling up at a separate pump. In reality, he had transferred Elizabeth's body from the trunk of the Honda to a rental car that he had arranged to have waiting at the station, parked behind the building where no one would notice the exchange. He had driven the Honda to the wooded area where it would eventually be found, leaving it hidden but not so carefully hidden that it wouldn't be discovered eventually. He wanted it to be found. He wanted people to think Elizabeth had driven there herself and then simply walked away. The rental car, containing Elizabeth's body, he had driven to the old barn in Missouri, a property he had scouted weeks in advance. He had dug the grave himself, during one of those unexplained pre-move visits. He had buried his wife, cleaned up the evidence, returned the rental car to a different location than he had picked it up, and then continued to Missouri as if nothing had happened. The children had been told that their mother had gotten lost, had probably taken a wrong turn, would surely show up soon. By the time they realized she wasn't coming, by the time the police became involved, Richard had already created an impenetrable story that would withstand 3 decades of scrutiny. Until now, when he finished speaking, the courtroom remained frozen in horrified silence. Then Jessica's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. Why? It was a single word, but it contained everything. Every year of wondering, every night of grief, every birthday without a mother, every wedding without a maternal blessing, every grandchild who would never know their grandmother. Richard turned slowly to face his daughter. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his expression as unreadable as it had always been. Then he spoke. She wouldn't let go. I needed my freedom, my future, and she refused to give them to me. I asked for a divorce, and she said never. I tried to reason with her, and she quoted Bible verses. I told her about Carolyn, hoping she would be angry enough to leave, and she said she would pray for me, but never release me from our vows. She was never going to stop. The only way to be free was to make her stop. Daniel rose from his seat, his entire body shaking with rage he had carried for 35 years. You murdered our mother because she wouldn't give you a divorce? You destroyed our lives, destroyed her life, because you couldn't wait? Because your mistress couldn't wait? Richard met his son's eyes without flinching. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for understanding. You wanted the truth, and now you have it. That's all I can give you. The judge intervened, calling for order, directing Daniel to resume his seat. The formal proceedings continued with the sentencing, which had been agreed upon as part of the plea bargain. Richard James Crawford was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Given his age and health, this was effectively a death sentence. He would never again see freedom. He would never again sit on a porch drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. He would die in a prison cell, exactly as he deserved. As he was led away in handcuffs, Richard paused at the door of the courtroom. He turned back one final time and looked at his children, the people he had orphaned, the people he had lied to for their entire lives. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The door closed behind him, and Richard Crawford was gone from their lives forever. The funeral for Elizabeth and Crawford took place on a crisp March morning in Ridgewood, Illinois, 35 years after she should have been laid to rest. The community that had lost her so long ago gathered to finally say goodbye, to honor the woman whose memory had never faded despite the passage of decades. Dorothy Winters, now 92, insisted on attending despite her failing health. She was brought in a wheelchair, wrapped in blankets against the spring chill, but her eyes were clear and her voice was steady as she spoke about her friend. Elizabeth was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel valued, Dorothy said, addressing the crowd gathered at the graveside. She listened when you talked. She remembered the things you mentioned in passing. She showed up with casseroles when you were sick and flowers when you were sad. She was taken from us too soon, and she was hidden from us for too long. But she was never forgotten. Not by me. Not by anyone who truly knew her. Jessica spoke next, holding a piece of paper with trembling hands, reading words she had written and rewritten a dozen times. Mom, I'm sorry it took so long to bring you home. I'm sorry I ever doubted you, ever believed that you might have left us. I know now that you never would have. You loved us too much. You loved us in ways I didn't understand until I had children of my own. I've tried to be the mother you were, the mother you would have continued to be if you had been given the chance. I hope I've made you proud. I hope you're at peace now. I hope you know how much we miss you every single day. Daniel was the last to speak. He stood at the grave of the mother he had spent his adult life searching for, and for a long moment, he simply looked at the polished headstone bearing her name. I became an investigator because of you, he said finally. Every case I solved, every family I reunited, was because I couldn't do the same for our family. But we got there, Mom. It took 35 years, but we got there. The truth is out. Everyone knows what happened. Everyone knows who you really were. And everyone knows that you would never, ever have left us by choice. He paused, swallowing hard against the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. I'm going to keep doing what I do. I'm going to keep finding the lost and bringing them home. Because that's what you would have wanted. That's how I'm going to honor your memory. By making sure that other families don't have to wait as long as we did. By making sure that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep it's buried. The casket was lowered into the ground, and the gathered mourners said their final goodbyes. Flowers were placed on the grave. Prayers were whispered. Tears were shed for a woman who had been gone for 3.5 decades, but who was only now being truly mourned. As the crowd dispersed, Daniel and Jessica remained at the graveside, unwilling to leave their mother now that they had finally found her. What do we do now? Jessica asked quietly. Daniel considered the question. For so long, his life had been defined by the search for answers. Now that the answers had been found, what purpose remained? We live, he said finally. We live the lives she would have wanted for us. We love our families. We remember her every day. And we never, ever let anyone forget that Elizabeth and Crawford existed, that she mattered, and that justice was served. Jessica nodded slowly. She would have liked that. They stood together in the spring sunshine, brother and sister, survivors of a tragedy that had shaped their entire existence. Behind them, the community of Ridgewood continued their lives, forever changed by the reminder that evil could wear a familiar face, that monsters could hide in plain sight, and that the truth could remain buried for decades before finally clawing its way into the light. But also changed by the reminder that justice was possible, that persistence mattered, that love was stronger than lies, and that some bonds could not be broken, not by murder, not by time, not by anything in this world. Elizabeth Crawford was home. Richard Crawford would die in prison 18 months later, alone and unmourned. His name remembered only as a cautionary tale about the lengths to which evil would go to achieve its ends. Daniel continued his work as a private investigator, becoming one of the most successful in the country at solving cold cases. He started a foundation in his mother's name, providing resources and support for families of missing persons. Every year, on the anniversary of Elizabeth's funeral, he visited her grave and told her about the cases he had solved, the families he had helped, the lives he had changed because of what she had taught him about never giving up. Jessica became an advocate for victims' rights, speaking at conferences and legislative hearings about the need for better resources, better training, better attention to missing persons cases. She wrote a book about her mother's case that became a bestseller, ensuring that Elizabeth's story would reach millions of readers and inspire countless others to keep searching, keep fighting, keep believing in the possibility of justice. And in Ridgewood, Illinois, a memorial garden was dedicated to Elizabeth's memory, a quiet space where anyone could sit and reflect on the fragility of life and the enduring power of truth. A plaque at the entrance bore words that Daniel had chosen himself, in memory of Elizabeth Anne Crawford, who was lost but never forgotten, hidden but finally found. May her story remind us all that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that love is the light that guides us home. The garden blooms every spring, flowers of every color filling the space with beauty and hope. Visitors come from across the country, people who learned about Elizabeth's story and wanted to pay their respects. Children play on the nearby grass while their parents read the plaque and whisper quiet prayers for a woman they never knew but will never forget. And somewhere, somehow, Elizabeth Crawford watches and smiles. Because in the end, truth prevailed, love persisted, and justice, though it arrived 3.5 decades late, was finally gloriously served.